In 1942, while armies fought across continents, another war was being organized inside offices. Designs were approved, slogans were cut down, fear was sharpened into an image. Then the presses began to run. A poster left the building as nothing more than ink on paper. But once it reached a factory wall, a railway station, or a school corridor, it carried the voice of the state. It told civilians what to hide, what to sacrifice, whom to distrust, and what victory was supposed to look like. The strange part was not that governments used propaganda. Rulers had always tried to control belief. The strange part was the material that made persuasion portable. The same substance had already carried tax registers, court judgments, land titles, arrest orders, and banknotes. It could record a person, classify them, grant permission, deny movement, create value, or print an enemy. Paper looked weak because it could be torn by hand, but institutions had spent centuries making it stronger than memory, testimony, and sometimes the people named on it. So, how did crushed fiber become powerful enough to help governments count their populations, command them from a distance, and manufacture what millions were expected to believe? A sheet of paper has almost no power by itself. It can be folded, soaked, burned, or torn in half with 2 fingers. Yet place that same sheet behind a government desk, add a signature or an official stamp, and it can decide whether someone may cross a border, inherit a house, collect a pension, enter a school, or remain in a country. At an airport, a traveler slides a passport beneath a glass screen. The officer does not ask for the full story of the person standing there. Childhood, family, work, fear, loyalty, and intention are reduced to a photograph, a name, a date, and a series of marks. The booklet is opened, a database is checked. For a few seconds, the document speaks more loudly than its owner. In another office, a clerk lowers a rubber stamp onto an application. The sound is small, approved. Rejected, pending. Nothing visible has changed in the room. The applicant is still the same person, but outside that room, a door may now open or remain closed because ink touched paper in the correct place. This is the strange authority of the page. A receipt can prove payment. A certificate can establish a qualification. A summons can compel someone to appear. A ballot can register a political choice. A title deed can defend ownership. A form can convert a complicated life into boxes that an institution knows how to process. Paper did not invent administration. States had collected taxes, issued orders, and stored records on clay, bamboo, wood, papyrus, parchment, and silk long before paper became common. Nor did paper begin in a single miraculous moment. Fragments made from rags survive from centuries before Kai-Lun, the Han court official traditionally associated with improving papermaking around the beginning of the 2nd century. What changed was not simply the surface people wrote on. Paper could become light enough to carry, cheap enough to repeat, and orderly enough to stack. A report could move from a village to a capital. An order could travel back. Copies could accumulate. Shelves could become archives. A name, payment, accusation, or category could remain available after the people who recorded it were gone. And once an institution accepted the document as official, the page could do more than describe a decision. It could become the decision. That is why the most consequential words on paper were often not poems, discoveries, or prayers. They were permissions. Pay this. Report here. Prove who you are. Present this document. Do not cross. To understand how a material this fragile acquired that authority, we have to leave the modern office and go back to a workshop filled with worn cloth, plant fiber, wooden tools, and cloudy water, where a wet sheet was lifted from a vat before anyone knew how much power would one day be placed upon it. Paper did not begin as a clean white page. It began with things that had already been worn out. In an Eastern Han workshop, old cloth, hemp waste, bark, and damaged fishing nets could be cut apart, soaked, and beaten until their former shapes disappeared. A shirt stopped being a shirt. A rope stopped being a rope. What remained was fiber suspended in cloudy water. A worker lowered a framed screen into the vat and lifted it again with both hands. Water drained through the mesh. Across its surface, the fibers settled into a thin, trembling layer. The sheet was almost nothing yet. It could tear under its own weight. It had to be pressed, dried, and separated before a brush could touch it. But the transformation had already happened. Material discarded from ordinary life had been reorganized into a surface capable of carrying an order, a debt, a prayer, or a name. For generations, the story of this moment was condensed into one man and 1 year. Kai Lun, a palace eunuch and court official, was traditionally credited with presenting an improved papermaking method to the Han throne around 105 CE. Later accounts associated his process with bark, hemp remnants, old rags, and fishing nets. It was an elegant origin story. An inventor offers a new material to an emperor, and writing changes forever. Archaeology made the story less simple. Fragments of rag paper survive from at least the 2nd century BCE, long before Kai Lun's presentation. Some early examples may have served as wrapping rather than writing material. Kai Lun's importance was therefore not that he created paper from nothing. His name became attached to a decisive improvement in producing paper suitable for writing, and to its recognition within the imperial court. That distinction matters. Technologies rarely arrive in a single flash. They emerge through workers repeating motions, testing fibers, adjusting water, changing tools, and passing knowledge from one workshop to another. The official record preserves the man who approached the throne. It does not preserve the names of everyone who had already placed their hands in the vat. Inside the palace system, Kai Lun would have understood the value of a material that could be made from cheaper raw substances than silk, and handled more easily than bundles of bamboo or wooden slips. A court generated letters, inventories, reports, petitions, accounts, and commands. Every additional document created a material problem. Something had to be written on, transported, stored, and retrieved. The new sheet answered that problem quietly. It did not look like a weapon or a machine. It arrived wet, soft, and nearly transparent. Yet it could be stacked more densely than wooden slips and carried without the cost of silk. Once covered in ink, it could enter a palace archive, leave with a courier, or return bearing the reply of an official many days away. The court did not need paper because paper was beautiful. It needed a writing surface that could help government produce, move, and preserve more words. And so a material born from worn cloth and broken fibers began its first great transformation. Waste became a page. Craft became infrastructure. The hands that made the sheet disappeared, while the words placed upon it acquired names, titles, and seals. But paper would not reach its full power inside the workshop. It would reach that power when the sheet began to travel. A ruler can command only the people who can hear him. A document can command people he will never meet. At dawn, a courier leaves the capital with a packet wrapped against rain. Inside is an order carrying the language of the court. The road passes fields, rivers, checkpoints, and towns. Horses are changed, seals are inspected. Days later, in a provincial office, another official opens the packet before people who have never seen the ruler whose authority it carries. The emperor is absent, the command is not. That was one of paper's most consequential transformations. Authority no longer had to arrive as a royal visit, a shouted message, or a messenger trusted to remember every word. The language could travel in a fixed form. An official could read it, copy it, file it, and later prove that he had received it. China already possessed sophisticated administrative systems before paper became common. Qin officials produced standardized documents on bamboo and wooden slips centuries earlier. Taxes, labor obligations, military supplies, legal cases, and official correspondence did not wait for paper to exist. Paper changed the material burden of remembering them. A wooden slip could hold writing, but large records required bundles. Bamboo was durable, yet heavy in quantity. Silk was light and elegant, but expensive. Paper offered a surface that could gradually become easier to carry, stack, copy, and store. It did not create the administrative appetite for information, it fed it. Inside an archive, that appetite became visible. A clerk unties a bundle and searches for a name. The person named in the file is not in the room. Perhaps he is a farmer accused of withholding grain, a household behind on tax, or a local official suspected of reporting false numbers. His face, his explanation, and the conditions in his village are far away. On the desk are only entries, dates, amounts, and the words of other officials. The file moves upward. A decision moves downward. This was the bargain inside bureaucratic writing. Records allowed an institution to coordinate work across enormous distances and preserve information beyond the memory of any single official. They could expose theft, compare accounts, track supplies, and hold subordinates responsible. But they also allowed the written representation of a person to outrank the person himself. The archive did not contain a life. It contained what the state had chosen to ask about that life. Over time, imperial administrations generated mountains of routine documentation. Reports produced more reports. An order required confirmation. A payment required an entry. A local decision could be copied for review. By the Song dynasty, court historians worked within a government that generated immense documentary records, many of which could feed later historical compilation. Paper gave the state something more durable than a ruler. Institutional memory. An emperor could die. A minister could fall from favor. A clerk could be replaced. Yet a tax entry, a legal judgment, or an earlier command could remain on a shelf and return years later as evidence. The institution could remember obligations that the people involved might desperately wish it would forget. But archives were never neutral collections of everything that happened. Documents could be lost, altered, suppressed, misread, or preserved because one office considered them important. What survived was not simply the past. It was the past after passing through administrative hands. Paper had begun as fiber floating in water. Now it carried orders across provinces and stored versions of people inside rooms they might never enter. The next transformation would make it more powerful still. Once a government could place its seal on a sheet and persuade society to obey what was written there, paper would stop merely recording reality. It would begin creating it. The greatest leap in paper's power came when people stopped treating it only as evidence and began treating it as reality. In a market during the Song dynasty, a merchant receives payment that does not ring like metal. There is no string of copper coins, no silver weighed on a scale. Instead, another person places a printed note in his hand. The sheet is light. Its fibers are worth almost nothing compared with the value written across its surface. Yet the merchant accepts it because the note belongs to a larger system. Officials recognize it. State institutions accept it in designated transactions. Counterfeiters can be punished. Behind the paper stands the authority of government. Paper money had grown from earlier commercial practices, including deposit receipts issued when carrying heavy coin became inconvenient. By the 11th century, the Song government had established control over the printing of official banknotes. Later dynasties inherited the idea that value could be printed, circulated, and defended by law. A surviving Ming note issued in 1375 makes the bargain visible. It represents one string of 1,000 cash coins. Dragons frame the design. An image of the coins appears at the center. The Board of Revenue is named as issuer, and the inscription warns against counterfeiting. The paper does not contain 1,000 coins. It contains a command to treat the sheet as if it does. That command reveals something larger than the history of money. A document could now do more than preserve information about the world. Supported by recognized authority, it could change how the world responded. Consider a dispute over land. One person may remember where a boundary stone once stood. Neighbors may know who planted the trees, repaired the wall, or worked the soil for decades. Another person arrives carrying a deed recorded in the accepted form, bearing the correct names, witnesses, signatures, or seals. The official behind the desk cannot walk backward through every season of the property's history. The institution needs an answer it can process, so the document is unfolded. The lived past remains outside the room. Across different societies, legal traditions did not rely on paper in exactly the same way. Oral testimony, custom, palm leaves, parchment, wooden documents, and local registers continued to matter. A deed was not automatically true merely because it existed. It could be forged, disputed, mistranslated, or produced through coercion. But wherever institutions gave certain documents legal force, paper acquired a new kind of authority. A tax receipt could prove that an obligation had been met. A license could permit an activity that was otherwise forbidden. A certificate could establish rank, marriage, education, or status. A warrant could authorize seizure or arrest. The page did not merely report what an institution had decided, it carried the decision into the world. This power created opportunities as well as dangers. Written records could protect a person against a dishonest collector, preserve an agreement after witnesses died, or force an official to justify an action. A document could restrain arbitrary memory by leaving evidence behind. Yet the same logic could reverse against anyone whose life did not match the record. A misspelled name, a missing receipt, a destroyed deed, or an unauthorized seal could turn possession into trespass, payment into debt, and identity into suspicion. The question was no longer only what had happened. It was what could be documented in a form the institution recognized. Paper had become more than a surface for ink. It had become a machine for converting authority into reality. But one limit remained. Every note, deed, warning, and command still had to be copied. The next machine in paper's history would make the same words appear hundreds, then thousands, of times, and it would serve rebels and rulers with equal obedience. The printing press is remembered as a weapon against authority. Authority remembered to use it too. In a workshop in 16th century Europe, a printer locks pieces of metal type into a frame. He inks the raised letters, lowers the press, and pulls a fresh sheet free. On it is a short pamphlet attacking a bishop, a prince, or a doctrine that once seemed impossible to challenge. The words can now travel without the author. A few hundred copies move through markets, taverns, churches, and merchant routes. One is read aloud to people who cannot read it themselves. Another is hidden inside a bundle of cloth. By the time officials discover the text, the argument has already crossed a border. This was the promise that later generations remembered. Printing made replication faster. A message no longer depended on a scribe copying every line by hand. In the German lands, pamphlets written by Martin Luther and his supporters flooded the market during the Reformation. Dialogue, satire, images, and blunt language carried theological conflict far beyond universities and pulpits. But the press did not belong permanently to reformers. That afternoon, the printer clears the type. A new job arrives under official authority. This sheet bears a royal emblem, a legal order, or a warning against forbidden books. The same screw descends. The same paper receives the ink. The machine that multiplied dissent now multiplies the command intended to suppress it. Print had no moral allegiance. Churches, monarchies, and city governments quickly understood that printed words could standardize doctrine, announce laws, publish proclamations, defend rulers, and identify dangerous ideas. Authorities licensed printers, inspected shops, restricted imported books, and punished clandestine production. Catholic governments developed systems intended to limit Protestant publications. Protestant governments censored opponents as well. The contest was not simply between speech and silence. It was a struggle over who could reproduce a message legally, cheaply, and repeatedly. Imagine an official broadside being pasted to a wall in a market square. The ruler who authorized it may be hundreds of miles away, yet the emblem at the top, the formal type, and the threat near the bottom give the page a public voice. A town crier may read it aloud. A magistrate may enforce it. A citizen may recognize the layout before understanding every word. The page looks official because an entire structure stands behind it. Approved wording, authorized printer, paper supply, and distribution. An illegal pamphlet must build its own network. It needs a printer willing to take the risk, buyers who will hide it, readers who will pass it on, and routes that avoid inspection. Its danger lies not only in what it says, but in the possibility that copies may escape control. Censorship, therefore, did not require the destruction of every press. It could work by granting privileges to selected printers, limiting the number of legal shops, requiring approval before publication, and making unauthorized printing expensive or dangerous. Under England's Licensing Act of 1000, 662. Institutions including the Stationers' Company, the Surveyor of the Press, and church officials participated in policing illicit print. Yet control was never complete. Type could be moved, names could be omitted, false locations could be added. A press could operate at night, then disappear. Printing did not democratize truth, it democratized replication. That distinction changed politics and public life. More people could encounter competing claims, but repetition did not guarantee accuracy. The side with better access to presses, paper, money, legal protection, and distribution could make its version of events appear more frequently and more officially. Paper had given institutions a memory. Printing gave them a voice that could speak in thousands of identical copies. But hand presses still moved one impression at a time. Their output remained tied to individual sheets, human labor, and the physical rhythm of the pressroom. The next transformation would break that rhythm. Paper itself would begin to move through a machine as a continuous stream, feeding newspapers, forms, advertisements, and eventually propaganda on a scale no hand press could sustain. Bureaucracy did not become modern when it hired more clerks. It became modern when paper stopped arriving one sheet at a time. Before that change, the page still began in a rag room. A worker stood before heaps of discarded linen and cotton, torn shirts, worn bedsheets, sailcloth, rope, and scraps bought by collectors moving through towns. The rags had to be sorted by quality and color. Seams, buttons, and dirt were removed. The cloth was cut, cleaned, softened, and beaten until it lost the last evidence of the bodies that had used it. Then came the vat. A papermaker dipped a mold into suspended pulp, lifted a single wet sheet, and passed it to another worker. The motions could be repeated all day, but each sheet remained a separate act. One dip, one lift, one transfer, one page. This rhythm imposed a ceiling on the paper world. Printers could improve presses. Governments could demand more forms. Newspapers could seek more readers. But every expansion depended on mills producing enough individual sheets to feed them. In France, near the end of the 18th century, Nicolas Louis Robert tried to break that rhythm. Robert worked at a paper mill connected to the Didot printing family. Instead of lifting pulp on a fixed mold, he imagined a moving surface, an endless band of wire cloth carrying a thin layer of fibers forward while water drained beneath it. In 1798, he completed a prototype. A French patent followed in January 1799. The principle was simple enough to describe and difficult enough to perfect. Pulp and water flowed onto a moving wire. The mesh retained the fibers while the water fell away. Rollers pressed the fragile web. Further drying turned it into a continuous length of paper. For the first time, the sheet did not have to end where the mold ended. Robert's design then passed through disputes, financial trouble, and new owners. Saint Léger Didot took models to his English brother-in-law, John Gamble, who secured an English patent for an improved version in 1801. Henry and Seely Fordrinier financed further development and engaged engineer Brian Donkin. By 1807, a more workable machine had emerged. The machine changed what paper could become. Inside a mill, the material now moved like a pale river. Fiber slurry entered at one end. Water vanished through wire and pressure. A damp web passed through rollers and emerged as a reel that could later be cut into thousands of pages. The machine did not eliminate labor. It reorganized it. Workers still prepared fiber, controlled the flow, watched tension, handled brakes, maintained rollers, dried the web, and moved heavy reels. A torn section could halt production. A poorly balanced mixture could ruin a long run. Human attention remained essential, but it now served the pace of the machine rather than setting it. Once paper became continuous, paperwork could become continuous too. During the 19th century, expanding presses, rising literacy, faster transport, growing companies, and larger states combined with machine-made paper, newspapers reached mass audiences. Schools consumed standardized books and exercise sheets. Offices filled with invoices, ledgers, census schedules, military forms, insurance documents, ballots, and advertisements. No single machine created those institutions, but the continuous paper web gave them a material supply large enough to repeat their daily demands. Later, wood pulp reduced dependence on scarce linen and cotton rags and tied paper production more closely to forests, chemical processing, water, and energy. The page appeared cleaner and more plentiful than ever, while extraction and industrial waste moved farther from the reader's sight. The old papermaker had made one sheet at a time. The industrial mill made a stream, and once that stream could cover desks, streets, schools, and railway stations, the state gained more than paper for its records. It gained enough paper to manufacture attention. By the time a wartime poster reached a factory wall, most of its emotional force had already been engineered in a room the public would never see. An artist lays a draft on a government table. The image is clever, crowded, and difficult to read from across a room. Officials study it, mark the margins, and ask the question that matters most to the campaign. What should a passerby feel in the first second? The draft returns to the artist. Details disappear. The slogan becomes shorter. The danger moves closer. A shadow appears behind a family. An enemy eye fills the background. Or a careless civilian is shown placing soldiers at risk. The revised page no longer invites contemplation. It demands a reaction: fear, duty, silence, sacrifice. Propaganda had existed long before the 20th century. Rulers had placed victories on monuments, churches had circulated religious images, and political movements had used pamphlets and caricatures against their enemies. But industrial paper, mass printing, rail transport, advertising techniques, and centralized states allowed persuasion to become an organized production system. The United States created the Office of War Information in June 1942 to coordinate information about the war at home and abroad. Its work extended across radio, film, photography, news, and print. Within that larger effort, government posters addressed recruitment, factory labor, war bonds, rationing, resource conservation, secrecy, and national unity. The poster was only the visible end of the process. Before ink touched paper, someone selected the audience. Someone wrote the message. Someone approved the image. Budgets, printing orders, paper allocations, and distribution plans followed. The emotional command on the wall emerged from memoranda, meetings, revisions, and administrative decisions that were deliberately unemotional. Propaganda was not the opposite of paperwork. It was paperwork reorganized around emotion. In a printing plant, the approved design is fixed onto the press. The first copies arrive as individual sheets. Soon they become stacks. The stacks become bundles tied for transport. Trucks carry them to factories, railway stations, post offices, schools, military offices, and shop windows. A worker pastes one to a wall. Another appears above a factory clock. A third is placed where commuters will see it while waiting for a train. The image begins to feel unavoidable, not because it appeared everywhere by accident, but because a distribution system placed it everywhere on purpose. Different campaigns demanded different feelings. Some posters presented national unity as warm and reassuring. Others glorified industrial labor or encouraged women to enter war work. Careless talk campaigns turned ordinary conversation into a potential threat, warning that an unseen enemy might be listening. Posters could reduce complex military and political realities to a face, a gesture, and a sentence large enough to read while walking. Their effectiveness is difficult to measure precisely. A poster could not force a person to buy a bond, remain silent, or accept a government's version of the war. Audiences interpreted messages through their own experiences, prejudices, loyalties, and doubts. But governments behaved as though repeated images mattered. They invested money, skilled artists, official authority, printing capacity, and valuable paper in the attempt to shape public conduct. This created a new administrative view of the population. People were no longer only names in tax registers or files. They became audiences, workers, mothers, soldiers, consumers, patriots, potential recruits. Each category could receive a different command, wrapped in a different emotion. The bureaucracy that had once collected information from the public had learned to send feeling back. Paper made that exchange visible. A form asked the citizen to provide a name, a number, or a declaration. A poster answered with an instruction about how that citizen should behave. But the wall was not the end of this history. Once institutions learned to classify audiences, simplify messages, test emotional appeals, and distribute them at scale, paper was no longer essential to the method. The poster could leave the wall and enter the screen. The final form of paper's power was not the document on the desk. It was the human being reconstructed inside it. At an airport, a traveler places a passport on a scanner. The booklet still contains paper pages, but the decisive exchange happens through a chip. A digital signature is checked. A facial image may be compared with the person standing before the gate. The border officer can be replaced, at least for part of the process, by cameras, software, and a barrier that opens only when the record is accepted. The old passport spoke through ink, stamps, and handwriting. The electronic passport speaks through data. That change can make travel faster and documents harder to alter without detection. But the underlying act remains familiar. A person arrives with a body, a history, and an explanation. The system asks for a standardized representation that can be verified quickly. The same logic appears far from the border. An applicant opens an online form. The page requests a legal name, an address, an income range, a citizenship status, and a reason for applying. There is space for 40 characters where the truth requires a paragraph. A drop-down menu offers 4 categories when the applicant's situation fits none of them. The person hesitates, then chooses the least inaccurate answer. When the form is submitted, it becomes a record. It may enter a queue, trigger a rule, be compared with another database, or be sent to an employee who will never meet the applicant. The paper has vanished, but the boxes remain. Governments did not abandon records when offices became digital. They created electronic records, digitized older ones, built searchable archives, and developed systems for transferring, retaining, and preserving information created by computer applications. A record no longer needs a physical page to document an action or support a later decision. Digitization brings real advantages. Files can be found faster. Copies can be shared without moving boxes between buildings. Records can survive the decay, fire, or loss of a single sheet. Online services can remove journeys, queues, and repetitive manual work. But scale changes the danger as well as the convenience. A paper file had to be opened, read, and carried. A database can be searched across millions of entries. Categories can be compared automatically. A status can follow a person from one system to another. In some settings, profiling or automated processing may influence decisions with legal or similarly significant effects. Then the direction reverses. The institution no longer asks who you are. It predicts what message will move you. A political advertisement appears on a phone. It was not printed for a city or pasted where every passerby could see it. It may have been delivered to a selected audience using personal data, inferred interests, location, or other targeting criteria. Another voter may receive a different image, a different fear, and a different promise. The shared propaganda wall has fractured into private screens. This is why modern rules increasingly focus not only on the content of political advertising, but on who paid for it, why a person received it, and how personal data was used in targeting or delivery. Paper taught institutions to turn people into records. Digital systems learn to search, compare, preserve, and target those records without leaving a sheet behind. The material has receded from view, its grammar has not. The final question is no longer whether paper survived the digital age. It is whether any of us ever truly left the page. Tomorrow, a sheet of paper may still be waiting on a desk. It may be a receipt, a ballot, a certificate, a shipping label, or a form with an empty line where a name must go. It will feel light, ordinary, harmless enough to fold and place inside a pocket. But the page has carried older instructions. In a hand workshop, it rose wet from a vat of discarded fiber. In an imperial office, it became an order that could travel farther than the ruler's voice. Beneath a seal, it became value, ownership, permission, and proof. Inside a press, it learned to repeat. Inside a machine, it became continuous. On a wartime wall, it told entire populations what to fear, conceal, sacrifice, and believe. The commands changed with each age. pay, report, register, prove, obey, enlist, believe. Paper never carried those commands alone. A page required an institution willing to recognize it, an official prepared to enforce it, and a public trained to understand its marks. That was the source of its power, not the fiber, not the ink. The agreement that what appeared on the page could outrank what a person remembered, possessed, intended, or said. Now the page is disappearing from many of the places where its logic remains strongest. The file has become a database. The seal has become authentication. The archive has become searchable storage. The poster has become a targeted message seen by one person and hidden from another. The material changed. The questions did not. Who designed the form? Who chose the categories? Who is allowed to correct the record? Who decides which document counts, which voice is official, and which version of a human life becomes legible to power? A blank page seems to contain nothing. Yet before the first word is written, someone has already chosen its language, its boxes, its required answers, and the signature that will make it valid. Paper was never powerful because it remembered everything. It became powerful when institutions decided that what it remembered was real and what it omitted did not need to be seen. The page may look empty, but once power places it on the desk, it is already waiting to decide what you are.